Hi, everyone, and welcome to another episode of From a Woman to a Leader. And today I have a great pleasure talking with Shauna Vassell. And we are going to talk about a topic that I think is super, super critical, especially for women. We're going to talk about mastering difficult conversations. Before we get there, let me quickly introduce Shauna. Shauna is a leadership coach, and she's also a podcast host of Grow to Scale podcast. Hi, Shauna. Welcome.
Thank you for having me. I'm very excited to be on the show.
Very excited to have you. And I'll let you introduce yourself because you'll probably do a much better job than I do. So please tell us a little bit about what you do other than the little I told everyone.
I guess I can just say, outside of the fact that I'm a leadership coach, I've been doing leadership development now for a couple of years, and I actually started off this journey more in an organizational change role, and that was mostly focusing on how can we help organizations shift from one state to another state, and usually that involved a little bit of technology or it included a lot of culture changes as well. And a lot of my background was stemming from that. So for me, I got in, I do leadership development, but I also focus on helping organizations who are focused on making changes to their culture, to the team structure, or even to just help new managers or mostly middle managers kind of navigate the change within the organization, and also to help them to become better leaders.
Absolutely. That's wonderful. And share a little bit about your journey, right? From corporate roles to becoming a leadership coach and a podcast host. What inspired you to transition?
So actually, I used to be a project and change manager, as I mentioned. And one of the challenges that came up every single time was a conversation with myself and the person who had to implement the work that was being put forward. And for myself, like I had the job of I needed to report back and I needed to also track, how the project's doing and who's kind of my blockers and all of these things. And a lot of times I would have these very off the cuff conversation about, I'm not comfortable doing this. I don't think this is right. I don't know what they're talking about. Do you speak corporate? Because I don't, that this doesn't make sense. And it became such a reoccurring theme every time I had these conversations. And also when I was sitting, boots on the ground, it's very different than when you sit in a corporate meeting and, we're like, oh, we have a vision to take the organization from this state to that state and make this much money. And people on the ground are just like, what are they harping about? Who cares? Like, it's not going to change. We're not going to do this. It's not going to make a difference. And who are they going to fire? And it sounds different, right? The conversation is very different. So I actually started my journey because when I was on the ground, I could see how difficult it was for people to really understand what was being expected of them. And also from the standpoint of the executives who also have someone they have to report to. And also knowing that a lot of the change is sometimes good, but it's just a matter of the approach. So I started my journey into that role, going from project management into leadership development, because I realized the people who can make these changes are actually people who are leading the change and the people who are supporting the people on the ground to help them to kind of become more resilient and help them through the journey of it. So I decided, instead of me just doing the bottom changes and working with the people directly, let me work with the person who is responsible for taking care of these people and helping them throughout the journey. And that's how I became a leadership development coach, and just kind of decided this was just the thing for me. And it's been great because I love the work that I do because it's transformative. It helps people kind of shave off some of the limited beliefs they might have, as well as develop more on a personal level.
Yeah, absolutely. This is so incredible. Yeah. And obviously, navigating difficult conversation is very, very important in leadership. So, can you kind of introduce us? I know that you have a mini framework that you mentioned to me in our pre-recording call. Talk a little bit about your mini framework and how does it help your client assess and address the challenging situations?
So yes, so one of the first things I start off with anyone when we do change, I always ask the question, especially in difficult conversations, because when you do a lot of change work, it's either you're going to have an HR conversation at some point, you're going to either be changing things that are going to be very, very uncomfortable for various different levels of stakeholders and people that are involved. And a lot of times I ask the question, okay, what would you hear if the emotions weren't in this conversation? What would you actually hear? And when when I asked that question, people are like, what do you mean? What are you asking me? And I said, if you're not worried about your job, if you're not worried about the career limited move you're going to make, if you're not worried about your team hating you, if you're not worried about feeling like you're incompetent and all the emotions that come with everything that you're just thinking about, what would you actually hear during a difficult conversation? What would you actually receive from the other side? And what would the other side actually hear? And once they get to that state, this is where I help them to understand and lean into the difficult conversation. Because a lot of that, and I talked about kind of the ARC method, because the ARC comes before having that conversation, because it really is about what have you assessed from the situation? How do you reframe it into something that's usable so that there's intent and there's clear intent? And how do you communicate it? And that's really what it boils down to. So if you think about it, you're going through, what are the facts? What am I feeling? Who am I in this whole interaction? What is my personal attribution, which is, how you feel about your job, how you feel about what you're doing, and what are your assumptions? What do you think that person is going to do, feel, or say after the fact? And that's really, really important, because once you get there, you already start creating a baseline. And that baseline is what's going to help you to reframe the conversation based on intent. And intent is going to be, am I having a good, positive intent going into this? Or is it clouded by everything? And then once you get to that state, now you can start looking at, okay, if I challenge myself on this situation, what would the other side be thinking I'm doing? What would the other side, and you're putting yourself into that person's shoes. And this is where empathy shows up a lot more, because now you have some breathing room to actually think about the conversation. And this is where the communication gets a lot more clearer, and it can be more beneficial, because you're now looking at the conversation from not the what you're going to say, but how you're going to say it.
Great. Yeah. How you're going to say is so important, right? I mean, you can say the
Yes,
same thing and sound completely different. Both the voice
exactly.
matters, the tone, the expression.
Yes. And if you think about it, we all have the same basic needs. The only thing that's really different in any difficult conversation is our interest might be different. So we just need to figure out what different strategies do we need to apply to this to meet the interest. And that comes from an understanding of what the needs are and kind of what needs are not being met. And how can you present the information in a way that they can receive it?
Yeah, that's wonderful. Can you share maybe some examples of how it was able to impact maybe you or some other people that you coached?
Oh yeah. Okay. So I'll share one example in particular. So I had someone who was fairly new going into a role that was once filled by someone who was very, very seasoned. And one of the challenge that they were having was they needed to have a lot of tough conversations with the existing team members, because how it was done was very different from what the expectation is going into the role. So the old guard, they had a system that they were working with. The new CEO came in and said, we can't do what we were doing before, so we need to change this. So her role was to come in and actually change the dynamic of the department but as part of that, not lose the expertise in the department while doing so. And having those conversations, she was going in headfirst going, I'm just going to tell them they're professionals. They know what they're doing. Like they understand what's going on. I'm pretty sure it's not going to be a big deal. And going into the first conversation, it was roadblock. It was roadblock after roadblock after roadblock. And she was so frustrated. She was to the point where she's like, I don't know if I can do this because they're not letting me in. They're literally going behind my back. Like, this is going to be like, I came here highly recommended, and now I look like I'm incompetent. And it was a big conversation around, because there's pressure to get things done. And after that conversation, I said, okay, let's take a step back. What are the facts? What exactly are they telling you? And she's like, well, they're pushing back that it's not realistic. It's not this, it's not that. I don't care, but I don't care because I have to do it. I need to do it. So I said, okay, so you've now said what they're saying doesn't make sense because you know better than they do. Am I hearing this correct? Because that's what it sounds like. So that's looking at the situation right now and just assessing it to see if does it work.
Mm-hmm.
And based on just those two things, she paused and said, well, that's not what my intent was. I was just saying, their timelines doesn't work for what we have in mind. So I said, did you communicate that? Because you're so clouded by this emotion of them stonewalling you and you looking like you're incompetent and you come in highly recommended that you miss the entire premise of this conversation that could have been had. So what exactly did you do to reframe this? And she's like, well, I didn't try to. I just kind of said, well, this is the timeline and that's what we're going to do. Mm-hmm. So, okay. So you gave them an ultimatum. Okay. So let's start over. So once we got to that state, it was more of a reflection for her. So when she was going to have those difficult conversations, she already know that, okay, the person that is in front of her, definitely an expert, definitely been around for a while. Now she has a different perspective on why they're pushing back, because now she had to go back and look at what exactly is it that this person's trying to say to me, and what am I not hearing because the emotions are clouding me. And one of the things we work on is a relationship plan, because in order to make those kind of change, you have to really take it from an individual level, especially by just individual level or department level. Because if you do broad strokes on just relationships, it will never get you anywhere because you're assuming everybody has the same interests, and they don't. So it's really about narrowing down your focus and customizing kind of your approach. So once we got to that state and we talked about it and we had lots of different back and forth, she went back to those meetings and they were more receptive. For some reason, they're more receptive. And I said, well, did they change or did you change? Because clearly in this conversation, she changed her approach because she had more time to actually take the emotions out of it and put it on the side. And one of the big things that I've always kind of shared, and even for myself, like for my own experience, I'm one of those who has very strong values on, you got to do the right thing. If it's right, I don't care what you're doing. It needs to be right. It needs to be correct. It needs to be accurate. It needs to be, like morals, all this principle things. But then I realized as I went through change and met so many people during the change process, what I consider to be right might be what you consider to be wrong. So the only thing that we need to focus on is what is the priority in this entire situation, and then take it from there. Because that's the part that we can hit the common ground. Because if we go by right or wrong, it's going to be skewed based on our own experiences and what we believe to be right or wrong. So when we had that conversation, and I shared that with her as well, I said, well, for you, what's right is this. For them, what's right is that. Maybe you need to come back to a common ground and understand the variations between what's right or wrong. And then get to what's important and then start there. And that's one example that I could say.
Yeah. Yeah, and I think that there are a lot of kind of lessons here. I mean, right? Putting emotions aside, really making an effort to hear and
Yeah,
understand the other person, right? I mean, what they're saying to you, where are they coming from? Not just where you are coming from, but and this is, I think, like one of the areas that leaders struggle with the most. They look inwards, they don't look outwards a lot of times, like on the other person, like
mhm,
how are they coming? So looking at the other side and also assessing like different values and different ways of assessing things, different perspectives, and trying to find a common ground like between.
exactly, exactly. Very, very important. You have to find that common ground at some point, because that's going to be the point where you can say definitively, this is where we agree. Let's move the conversation forward.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. So, what kind of frameworks do you recommend? I know that there are a lot of frameworks for feedback and, like SBI and others. Like, do you have kind of any tips for people maybe who wants to kind of level up and learn some known frameworks or strategies that they can use?
Yeah, so I actually really like using one, and this one was actually created by the Center for Creative Leadership, and it really helps when you're leading, when you're trying to get behavior change. And it's called the situation behavior impact model, and what it is, it's really about focusing on what's the situation that you're trying to bring forward from a context perspective, and what's the behavior that you're pulling from that behavior, that situation, and the impact. And the reason why I like it is because it helps to take that emotion piece out of it, because it sets the stage. It allows you to be very specific in the situation. You're not focusing on generalities. So you're in the situation piece, you're really just focusing on where you were, when it was. So what time? So if the situation was in a meeting situation, you're saying last week in our team meeting, last week Thursday in our team meeting, you did X, Y, and Z. You were on your phone. And what you were highlighting from that is really the impact of what happened in that meeting based on the situation and based on the behavior. So you're not attacking the person, you're focusing on the facts while you're in that situation. So I like it because it helps you to set the stage with the situation, helps you to focus on the area of change, and it helps you to highlight the results or the behavior outcome that you're trying to identify and get some growth from. So if you are looking to have conversations or tough conversations from that. So if you take the ARC model and you're actually looking at that, and then you get to the communication piece and you say, okay, how can I give someone feedback? The first thing you would do is like look at the situation, look at what the behavior is, and then look at how did it impact the team, the group, you, whoever it is, and then take it from there. And like I said, an example of that is you're going to say, if you have someone who has performance issues, or they've come into a meeting and you know that you want everybody engaged in the meeting, they're not participating, they're either on their phone, laptops, and you want people to have open discussion, you can start the conversation by saying, okay, well, we had a team meeting this morning, our 11 o'clock team meeting this morning, you were on the laptop the entire time. There were a number of key issues that kept coming up from our one-on-ones that you kept talking about, but you had an opportunity to talk about it there, but you were on the laptop. I just wanted to understand kind of where you are with this, what's happening. Is there something that's a priority over the meeting? Let's talk about it. That way you're open in the conversation and you're giving them a chance to actually, one, reflect back to the context of where they were when they were doing it. Two, understand, okay, well, yes, I was on my laptop. Okay, seems to be a problem. Okay, so now what's the impact? Well, I didn't actually participate and I didn't get to talk about the issues that I was complaining about. So it gets them to go into that reflective mode, and you're not blaming them. You're just saying, we were talking about this. You wanted to discuss this, but you didn't do it. So help me understand what's going on. How can I support you in this moving forward? And this way it's clear, it's clean, and they're able to say, well, give you at least an idea of what's happening. Is there something else that's burning that was more important?
Absolutely. And reaching the conversation from blameless, not making any assumptions, curiosity, asking open-ended questions like, where are you coming from? Like, as you said, like maybe something was more important, and really opening up the conversation rather than closing it. Because a lot of times people tend to say, well, you're not paying attention, you don't care, make a lot of assumptions, which create a lot of defensiveness and closing the conversation, biasing the conversation to an opinion that you have that may not be true at all.
Exactly. And this is, and that's why I personally like that one, because it really does keep the conversation open enough where if they do feel like they need to go into defensive, you can then circle back to, hey, this is an event that happened. I just want to address it so I understand what's the best way to support you, or if there is an issue, or if this is not an issue, then I want to have an open conversation about what this made X, Y, and Z feel. Or, because in most cases, if you're thinking about it, you look at it from a bigger impact. Because if someone is doing something, it's creating rifts in the team. You as the leader, you have to get to that state where you can have that conversation. And the thing is, a lot of people are not comfortable with difficult conversation just overall. And the reason why difficult conversation is so hard is because it's so uncomfortable. It's, what is this person going to think of me? What am I going to feel? What if this goes sideways? And it's all of the above. But if you focus it back on, okay, this is what happened, not placing judgment, I'm having this conversation because I want you to know moving forward, I'd really love for you to be more engaged in the meeting and take it from there. If you don't see behavior change, you have to address it. Because I had one person in particular, they didn't address the behavior issue until it became something they needed to address based in a PIP. And when that happened, the person did not give her any opportunity to coach, to mentor her, to do any of that. She just said, you know what, I quit. I'm over it. I'm not going to stay. You treated me like X, Y, and Z. And there was no more conversation. Now, from her perspective, okay, she got rid of her. But from her actual manager, they actually looked at it as that's a performance issue for her, because this could have been avoided if she addressed some of the issues in advance. So in her mind, she's saying, well, I got rid of her. But in the manager's mind, when she did the feedback at the end, when they did the closeout, the reflection was more on, did the manager do all that she could to support her while she was there? And the response was, no, I didn't hear about it till the last bit. And then she wanted to write me up. And I felt like I was targeted. So it became a bigger HR issue. But for her, she could have just addressed it right there and then. And that was one of the things, she was avoiding it.
Yeah. And many managers avoid it. Absolutely. Yeah.
And so if you avoid it, what's going to happen to you, right?
Yeah, I think that the approach I like to take usually when a coach is to see that in a different angle, right? I mean, entering a different conversation is not easy. But if you look at it as growth, as something you learn from, as something that you evolve as a leader, you become a better leader.
Yes.
And then it kind of helps you. I'm not saying it makes it easy, but at least, it makes it at least serve some purpose. It served the purpose, not just of, as you said, like with this manager, example of helping others and helping them, stay and grow instead of just doing a PIP. But also helping you as a leader become a better leader and evolve, because no matter what you'll do, eventually you'll have to face those challenges.
Exactly. And this was one of the challenges that she had in the conversation, because for the most part, it was, I do not like to give people negative feedback. And I said, okay, there's nothing wrong with giving negative feedback if it is to help someone improve. And what you consider negative might be someone's growth metric, in a sense that they might not know that they are actually doing this. So how can you measure, going back to what I think is right versus what I think is wrong? You might not know that that person is aware of what they're doing. And the impact, going back to the feedback model, if you think about the impact, if that person is not showing up, is giving you the reports late, is not giving you correct information, there's an impact somewhere. And what is the impact? Maybe they don't even know because you haven't shared it. So if they're clear on what it is, you have to kind of have a conversation about what it is. And if you're thinking that I can eliminate the anxiety and the fear of talking to people about this stuff by just avoiding it, it actually compounds, because over time it gets into a bigger issue, because now you have to have a much bigger conversation that might snowball, because they might have made a bigger mistake. And that person might be looking at, well, you've always just approved it or took it back and did it. So what's the issue now? So, and I've had people where they've said, in 360s, well, she takes the stuff and she just updates it herself. So what's the point? Why am I here if she's going to do my work for me? And if you think of that, you're also robbing your employees of the opportunity to grow.
Yeah, that's a great way to look at this. And another thing is that we grow by making ourselves uncomfortable. I mean, there's no other way to grow rather than expand your comfort zone. And the more you do it, it will eventually become more comfortable. So the
Yes.
more you kind of put yourself out there and you challenge yourself with
Yes.
difficult conversations, the more comfortable you become. I'm not saying it will become something you like doing, but it will become easier. And I always recommend starting small. Starting
Yes.
with small things, not like with a big performance issue or something really big that has a huge impact, but something small.
Yes. And it's always, and I always say, whenever you feel like there's friction or tension in a particular area or conversation that you're about to go in, lean into it on your own time to understand what part of that conversation really triggers you or actually makes you feel this way. And if you lean into that and really understand what it is, because for instance, the person who avoided it, for her, she wanted to create a fun environment. She didn't want to be the bad person. She wanted to be that person who could be, seen as that cool manager. And because of that, she lost sight of the fact that people there actually wanted her to manage them, to actually, and I say manage, but to actually be a mentor to them. And she missed that opportunity. So when I reflected back and I said, okay, well, being a cool manager doesn't mean that you avoid the mentoring part. Course correcting people if they go off track is part of being a cool manager, because they're looking up to you to guide them as well. So if you reframe it enough to think of it from another angle, it's not that slap on the wrist. It's more of, how can I help support you here? Because what the expectation is X, but somewhere somewhere in this spectrum, you're on Y. So is it more of, you need some help? Do you need training? Do you need support? Like, what do you need from me to make it better? or how can we grow together? And if you reframe it like that, you will have someone who will be more open to a conversation, even when it's a very tough conversation.
Yes, because they will realize that you're on their side. You're not against them.
Yeah.
You're in this together and you're trying to help them grow. And eventually, people are motivated by growth, by seeing how their career progress. There's nothing that people are more discouraged than not realizing why they are not progressing. And when you actually give them feedback, you help them. You help them grow and progress. So it's actually, if you look at it differently than, oh, I'm saying something negative to someone versus, oh, I'm helping them grow, it may be easier.
Yeah. And sometimes you can start the conversation if it's the start of the conversation that you're like, oh my God, I'm gonna have this talk. Just say, you know what? I wanna open the floor to, I want to chat with you about X, or about something that happened. I'm a little nervous about how you might take it. So bear with me if I have to work through a few iterations of this, but I wanted to kind of start the conversation about this. Sometimes people will appreciate that versus you just going into like avoidance, because avoidance means that you're never touching on the issue. You're never giving them a chance to even talk about it. And if you think about it, if that person is still in the dark about how you feel about a quality of work, and they're looking for you for feedback, and you just kind of say, oh, it's fine. And then you present something that looks absolutely nothing like what they did. They already got the writings on the wall that you didn't like what they did. Instead
Yeah.
of just, I would really love for you to change this or make X, Y, and Z edits so that we can have this, and we set the stage for the expectations for future.
Yeah, absolutely. And I wanted to ask you something. Obviously, we're talking in general, but I know that many women that I coach face challenges that are specific to women. They're afraid of, being called aggressive, and so forth. So, what kind of tips do you have in the light of kind of difficult conversations that are more specific to women and even more specifically for women of color? If you have anything specific for them.
So so for me myself, I used to be called very direct in terms of my delivery, and a lot of that was because for me, I called it how I saw it, and I didn't really tack on the extra stuff because I didn't think I needed to. But if you again took the step back and really think about the receiver, you have to understand, if I want the message to be heard, well, how am I going to say what I need to say so it lands? And if you are going in and your approach is one way, but but how they receive it is going to either go over their heads or just kind of land flat, then you have a responsibility to pay attention to how you are communicating. So if I'm not saying as a woman leader, you need to adjust everything about your leadership style or your communication style. What I'm saying is, if you are receiving feedback that says it comes off as X, lean into it and ask, would love to hear more. Like, what part of this conversation feels like it's aggressive or feels like it's too much for you?
Mm-hmm.
And then that way you can get some direct feedback as to, is this person a person who needs to have the conversation a different way? And sometimes that's what it is. I know for myself, going into things, I'm very passionate. And one of the big things I identify right off the bat, I'm very task oriented when I go into projects or different teams. So I'll state that, because I think it's important for them to not only understand who I am, but understand that not every day, not all the time I'm going to be on. So I need to, so if I, for some reason, I don't have the filter on to say, hey, today is the day where I seem like the regular Shauna, then know that my intent is still clear. I'm just probably in task mode. And if that's the case, just tap me here and let me know that, hey, a little too much. And sometimes that works because that's an understanding that they don't take it personal. And that's why I really love team assessments, because once you get into team assessments, you really get a sense of who's working on your team. How did they work under pressure? How did they work with people of different types of styles? Because when you work with someone who's direct, to them, they're just talking. To you, it's excessive. So
Yeah.
when you really understand each other, I think that works better. So my advice to anybody who feels that way, lean into what it is. I always say, ask questions and clarify what exactly do they feel, because that's a perception of how you're communicating. And maybe for them, they might be one of those people who might be on the spectrum of that's a lot, and that's okay. But it's also for you to understand, if that person's not receiving me or receiving me well, is my message even getting heard, or am I coming across differently? And maybe it's just how you kind of navigate the communication with them. So I wouldn't tell anybody to change who they are. Never change who you are, especially as a woman of color. I would say don't change who you are. It is like, for me, I'm Jamaican. Jamaicans are known for being very outspoken. And because we're very outspoken, most people, the skill that people, or the unique thing people came to me for, was because when I was in any change role and I had to work with any executives, they knew I would not sugarcoat a single thing. A single thing. I might put a little bit extra words to pad it, but you're going to hear what it is. And from that, they were appreciative. So whenever I went into conversations, I didn't have to explain myself. I didn't have to do anything, because they knew whatever I was saying meant that I did the due diligence. I'm not blowing any smoke. They knew exactly what it was. So if that's the person you are, there is someone who appreciates that, because now more than ever, you need people who are able to go out there and say what needs to be said. But at the same time, they also need to make sure that you're not leaving a string of dead bodies for them to clean up. So it's about your approach.
Absolutely. So never change who you are,
Yes.
and use that as a strength, as you said. Well, Shauna, thank you so much for all the wisdom. I mean, this has been an incredible conversation. Before we end, tell our audience how they can find more about you and how they can reach out to you.
Yeah, so I'm actually on LinkedIn. So if you ever want to reach out, so I'm Shauna VA on LinkedIn, but my full name, if you type it in LinkedIn, you'll definitely see me. I don't think there are many of us on there, so Shauna Vassell. And for my website, it's www.concaved.com. So concaved with a K, so KONCAVED.com.
Perfect. And I will put the links on the show notes. So don't worry. Thank you so much, Shauna, for being here today. It's been a pleasure speaking with you.
Yeah, same here. Thank you for having me.